Allied soldiers, shocked. Axis engineers, stunned. In the final desperate winter of World War II, as the German Reich crumbled from every direction, one final weapon was taking shape. A steel monster so massive, so armored, that it looked less like a tank and more like a moving fortress. This was the Panzer VIII Maus, the heaviest, most powerful tank ever built in human history. In 1944, Hitler's obsession with wonder weapons had reached its peak. Rockets, jets, and experimental tanks filled secret facilities across Germany. But nothing came close to the Maus. Krupp's engineers were ordered to design a vehicle that would make every Allied tank obsolete, a weapon that could crush any defense and withstand any attack. The result was unlike anything the world had ever seen. A 188-ton colossus clad in nearly 10 inches of steel armor. A tank so large that when Allied pilots saw its blueprints, they thought it had to be a mistake. The Maus was powered by an aircraft-derived engine that could barely move it. Even at full throttle, it crawled forward at just 12 kilometers an hour, slower than a man could run. Bridges cracked beneath its weight. No rail car could carry it. It couldn't even cross most roads without destroying them. It was a machine too powerful for the world it lived in. But Hitler didn't care. He believed that the Maus would change the course of the war, that its sheer presence would terrify Allied forces into retreat. To him, it wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol, a monument to German engineering, and a final declaration that the Reich still had strength left. So, the factories kept building. Even as bombs fell from Allied planes above, engineers in underground facilities continued assembling the beast. By late 1944, the first prototype was ready for testing. Its main gun, a 128mm KWK-44 cannon, could penetrate any Allied tank from over 2 miles away. It was paired with a secondary 75mm gun, giving it more firepower than any land vehicle ever built. During the first trials, the ground shook as the Maus moved. Each step forward sounded like thunder rolling through the fields. The test drivers described it as terrifying, not because of the enemy, but because of the tank itself. The engine screamed, the gears strained, the steel treads cracked the earth beneath them. It was power, barely under control. But reality soon crushed the dream. Fuel was scarce, factories were bombed. Germany no longer had the time, the resources, or the manpower to mass-produce this monster. Only 2 prototypes were ever completed. One was fitted with a turret, the other just a hull used for testing. Neither would ever see battle. As the Soviet forces closed in, engineers at Kummersdorf received one final order: destroy the Maus, leave nothing for the enemy. Explosives were set, flames engulfed the steel beast, but even in destruction, the Maus refused to die. When the Red Army reached the site days later, they found the massive remains, the hull cracked but still intact, its armor barely scratched by the blasts. Soviet engineers stood in disbelief. They had never seen anything like it. One Soviet officer reportedly said, "If this thing had reached the front, we might not be standing here today." The Soviets salvaged what remained, combining parts from both prototypes into a single complete vehicle. That reconstructed Maus was shipped to Moscow for study. and today it still sits silent in the Kubinka Tank Museum, a relic of a war that pushed human engineering to its absolute limit. The mouse never fired a shot in combat. It never destroyed an enemy tank. It never changed the outcome of the war. But it became something more, a warning, a symbol of what happens when ambition eclipses logic, when pride builds monsters that even their creators cannot control. The mouse was supposed to be unstoppable. Instead, it stopped itself. To the Allies, it was a terrifying glimpse into what could have been. To the Germans, it was a final dream of dominance that turned into a nightmare of wasted steel. And to history, it remains the ultimate paradox, the most powerful tank ever built that never truly fought. The monster of steel, the Panzer VIII Maus.
As Berlin burned, chaos consumed the Nazi war machine. In the final days of the Third Reich, the German capital became a fortress of despair. Where fanatics fought for a doomed leader, civilians cowered underground, and soldiers no longer knew who their real enemy was. For 6 years, Hitler's empire had devoured Europe. But in April 1945, it began to devour itself. This is the story of how Germany's own army, the once fearsome Wehrmacht, turned its guns not on the Allies, but on itself, in a desperate struggle for survival. The last battle of the Third Reich was not fought for victory, but for escape from madness. By the spring of 1945, Berlin was no longer a city. It was a skeleton of steel and ash. Allied bombers had reduced entire districts to rubble. The Soviet Red Army was closing in from the east, smashing through the last defensive lines on the Oder River. Inside the Führer bunker, deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler refused to accept the inevitable. He barked orders to phantom divisions that no longer existed, demanding counterattacks from units that had been wiped out weeks earlier. For the first time, his most loyal generals began to lose faith. Field Marshal Keitel, General Krebs, and others could see that the end was near. But anyone who spoke the truth risked execution. The city's defenders were a tragic mix of old men and teenage boys, the Volkssturm militia, armed with Panzerfausts and blind hope. The few remaining tanks of the once mighty Wehrmacht stood beside hastily built barricades, while artillery thundered in the distance. Every street became a battlefield, every building a fortress. And yet, behind the crumbling facades, a darker battle was brewing, German against German. On the outskirts of Berlin, the Ninth Army was trapped by the Soviet advance. Encircled and running out of ammunition, its commander, General Theodor Busse, ordered a desperate breakout to the west. His men wanted to surrender to the Americans rather than fall into Soviet hands. But the SS, Hitler's elite guard, had other orders. No retreat, no surrender. Anyone attempting to withdraw would be shot. When Wehrmacht soldiers began to pull back, SS units opened fire on them, their own countrymen. The roads west of Berlin became scenes of horror, burning vehicles, dead horses, and German troops lying where they had been gunned down by their supposed allies. In one village near Halbe, a German captain pleaded with an SS major to let his wounded men pass. The answer came in bullets. The Wehrmacht responded in kind. For the first time, German regulars fought the SS openly. It was brother against brother, soldiers who had marched under the same flag now killing each other amid the ruins of the Reich. The Nazi state was eating itself alive. Inside Berlin, betrayal spread like wildfire. SS officers deserted their posts. Party officials burned their uniforms to avoid recognition. Even the Gestapo, once feared across Europe, could no longer enforce Hitler's madness. Goebbels screamed about loyalty and sacrifice over the radio, but few were listening. In the bunker, Hitler raged at the treachery of his generals, accusing them of cowardice and betrayal. He issued orders for the destruction of Germany's own cities, the so-called Nero Decree. Bridges, factories, power plants, all were to be blown up so nothing would remain for the Allies. But Albert Speer, his Minister of Armaments, defied him. He quietly ordered engineers to sabotage the destruction plans. For that act of defiance, millions of civilians would survive. Hitler's world was collapsing not because of Allied bombs, but because his own empire had turned against him. On April 25th, Soviet troops completed their encirclement of the city. Berlin was cut off from the rest of the world. Inside the ruins, pockets of resistance fought with hopeless courage. Tiger tanks rolled through the streets, their engines roaring between shattered buildings. Soviet artillery pounded from every direction, shaking the ground like an earthquake. Civilians hid in subway tunnels and basements as shells tore through the night. But even as the Red Army closed in, Hitler insisted that the city could still be saved. He promoted teenage Hitler youth to frontline heroes and sent them into the fire. Many never came back. In those final hours, the illusion of unity collapsed completely. Wehrmacht officers ignored orders from the bunker. Some surrendered to the Soviets. Others disguised themselves as civilians. A few committed suicide rather than fight their own people. The last defenders were no longer fighting for Germany. They were fighting for time, for escape, or simply for dignity in defeat. By April 30th, the Red Army was within a few hundred meters of the Reich Chancellery. Inside the bunker, the once mighty dictator was a broken man. He had married Eva Braun the night before, dictating his final testament to his secretary. Outside, shells exploded above the garden where his body would soon burn. At around 3:30 p.m., Hitler and Eva Braun took their own lives. Their guards wrapped the bodies in blankets, carried them upstairs, poured gasoline, and set them ablaze. The Third Reich, built on fear and obedience, had ended in silence and smoke. Hours later, Goebbels followed, poisoning his own children before killing himself. The remaining officers in the bunker surrendered soon after. Above ground, Soviet soldiers raised their red banner over the Reichstag, the ultimate symbol of Germany's fall. But the fighting did not end with Hitler's death. Across Germany, remnants of SS units clashed with Wehrmacht troops trying to surrender. In towns like Lübeck, Munich, and Prague, the war's final days were marked by confusion, revenge, and rebellion. Some officers tried to save their men by defying the Nazi command. Others hunted traitors and deserters to the very end. In Bavaria, a group of German soldiers executed local Nazi officials who refused to surrender. In Prague, Czech resistance fighters battled the SS, while Wehrmacht troops quietly aided the uprising, turning their guns on their former masters. The empire that had demanded absolute obedience was now dissolving into open revolt. The Third Reich had died not only at the hands of its enemies, but from the weight of its own lies. Section 7. The Aftermath and Legacy. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Germany was a wasteland. Cities reduced to ashes, millions displaced, families shattered. But amid the ruins, something new began to emerge. Truth. For the first time, the German people saw the full horror of what had been done in their name. Concentration camps were liberated, and the crimes of the regime were laid bare before the world. The soldiers who had fought each other in those final days faced the same fate: captivity, shame, and the long reckoning that followed. The story of the last battle of the Third Reich is not one of victory or glory. It is a warning. It shows how absolute power consumes itself, how blind loyalty turns to chaos, and how even the most disciplined army can crumble when its cause is rotten at the core. As the fires of Berlin faded into the smoke of surrender, one truth remained. The Third Reich was destroyed not just by its enemies, but by the very hands that built it. In the end, Hitler's dream of total control collapsed under its own madness. The soldiers who once swore loyalty to him found themselves fighting for their own survival, and in doing so, they helped end the nightmare. The last battle of the Third Reich was not a battle for victory. It was a battle for the soul of a nation, and for the hope that, from the ruins of tyranny, something human could rise again.
Imagine an entire brigade gone, not captured, not retreating, not even reported, simply vanished. On a humid night in early 1942, as Japanese forces closed in on Singapore, more than 10,000 Allied soldiers disappeared from the battlefield. No warning, no radio calls, no footprints of retreat. It became one of the most haunting mysteries of the Pacific War. A moment buried under the fall of an empire, overshadowed by the collapse of an entire colony. But the truth behind this disappearance reveals something far bigger: a desperate gamble, a command failure, and the sacrifice of men the world was never meant to remember. This is the story of Singapore's Forgotten Brigade. By early February 1942, Singapore, once believed to be the strongest fortress in the East, was collapsing. The Japanese had swept down the Malayan Peninsula in just 55 days, cutting through defenses the British believed would last months. The myth of Fortress Singapore was already dead. But inside the city, over 85,000 Allied troops were still holding out: British, Indian, Australian, and local units, desperately digging in for a final stand. Among them were 3 Indian brigades stationed in the northwest. Their job was simple on paper: hold the line, delay the Japanese advance, buy time for counterattacks that never came. But the British command had made a fatal mistake. They believed the Japanese would attack from the sea. Instead, the real danger was coming across the narrow Johor Strait and straight into the sector held by the least equipped, least supported troops on the island. On February 8, 1942, as dusk settled over the mangrove swamps, Allied scouts noticed movement across the water. But it wasn't one barge or 10, it was hundreds. Japan was launching the largest amphibious operation in Southeast Asia, and the Forgotten Brigade was right in its path. The defenders sent up flares, machine gunners opened fire, but the Japanese kept coming, their boats gliding silently over the dark water. The Allied commanders assumed this was only a probing attack. They were wrong. This was the main assault. At 10 p.m., Japanese artillery unleashed a storm that lit up the sky. Then the barges hit the shore. The Indian brigades fought hard, bayonets flashing, machine guns red hot, and mortars dropping blind into the night. But they were spread far too thin. Some units were missing entire companies. Others had never fired their rifles under combat conditions. Within minutes, Japanese troops slipped through gaps that should never have existed. The Allied brigade radioed for reinforcements. None came. They radioed again. Silence. The Japanese had cut communication cables and jammed signals. The defenders were now blind and alone. Just after midnight, the last coherent message came through. Large enemy force, flanking both sides. Positions collapsing. We cannot hold. The transmission cut off. What happened next is still debated. All that's known for certain is this: by sunrise, the entire formation had disappeared. 10,000 soldiers, thousands of rifles, dozens of artillery pieces, entire command structures, gone. Some units had been completely overrun in the dark. Others had fallen back into the jungle and vanished into the chaos. Many were encircled and attacked from behind before they even realized the Japanese had landed. But perhaps the most tragic truth is this: no one in Singapore headquarters even knew they were gone. The Forgotten Brigade had been assigned too wide a front, with no reserves and no communication. When they fell, the gap in the line became a canyon. And through that canyon poured thousands of Japanese soldiers straight toward the heart of Singapore. By February 10, 1942, Japanese forces had seized reservoirs, command posts, and key roads. What was left of the brigade was scattered across the island, men fighting in small pockets, alone, running out of ammunition and water. Many surrendered. Many died. Others tried to link up with British or Australian units, but never reached them. Eyewitnesses describe men wandering the jungle, dazed, dehydrated, injured, still looking for orders that would never come. The fall of Singapore was sealed. General Percival, overwhelmed, desperate, and misinformed, never realized that the annihilation of the Northwest Brigades was the event that doomed the fortress. He believed the line was still holding long after it had collapsed. This delay gave the Japanese control of the high ground and vital water supplies, strategic positions that left Singapore defenseless. When British forces finally surrendered on February 15, 1942, Winston Churchill would call it the worst disaster in British military history. But within that disaster was a smaller tragedy, one never given the attention it deserved. The 10,000 men vanished that night were not cowards. They did not break. They were abandoned by a command system that underestimated the enemy, overextended its troops, and refused to believe the impossible could happen. Many survivors later described their experience as being erased. Their sacrifice was overshadowed by the scale of Singapore's fall, their story buried under the shame and shock of defeat. But history, if nothing else, offers one final justice, that the men of the Forgotten Brigade fought to the very end, alone, outnumbered, but unbroken. When we look back on the fall of Singapore, we see a symbol of collapsing empires, failed leadership, and strategic blindness. But within that collapse, we also find courage, loyalty, and a tragedy almost too large to imagine. The night 10,000 Allied soldiers vanished, not because they fled, but because no one ever came for them. This was the Forgotten Brigade of Singapore.
Please like and share and subscribe to Command History.
Please like and share and subscribe to Command History.
In the chaos of World War II, battles were often decided by numbers. More men, more tanks, more firepower. But on one frozen morning in 1944, deep inside the forests of Belgium, the war was changed not by an army, but by one tank fighting alone against an entire advancing battalion. This is the unbelievable story of the American M4 Sherman Cobra King, the lone tank that held back the German spearhead during the Battle of the Bulge, buying the Allies precious hours that would change the fate of the Western Front. A single tank crew, a single narrow road, and a German force 10 times larger than anything they could hope to defeat. December 19, 1944. Fog smothers the Ardennes forest. Snow muffles the world, and the American front line is collapsing. Hitler has unleashed hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles in a desperate gamble, a surprise offensive meant to punch through Allied lines and split the armies in two. Columns of German armor push through mountain passes, crushing defenses, overrunning towns, and sending entire American divisions into retreat. On a lonely stretch of road outside Bastogne, a small unit of U.S. tankers receives their orders. Hold the road. Hold it at all costs. They have one Sherman tank, a handful of rifles, and a single position overlooking the only route the Germans can use to advance. If they fail, Bastogne falls. If Bastogne falls, the Ardennes falls. If the Ardennes falls, the Allies lose their chance to end the war quickly. The stakes could not be higher. Inside the steel belly of the Sherman, the crew prepares for what they know is coming. Staff Sergeant Paul Jackson, the gunner, checks the elevation gear, frozen stiff. Corporal Sam Haynes, the loader, stacks shells within reach, armor-piercing, high explosive, whatever they have left. Lieutenant James Burke, commander, studies the fog ahead, listening for engines, tracks, anything. But there is nothing, just wind. And then, a low, thunderous rumble. Burke mutters a warning. Jackson swings the turret. Haynes loads the first round. Through the mist emerges a nightmare. German Panthers, their dark silhouettes crawling toward the roadblock like steel beasts. The crew knows the Panthers can slice a Sherman in two with a single shot. But retreat isn't an option. The lead Panther sees the Sherman. Its turret swivels. Time slows. Jackson fires. The 75mm shell slams into the Panther's lower glacis, a weak point. The tank erupts into flame, blocking the narrow road behind it. The Germans are shocked. They expected retreating Americans, not a lone tank standing in defiance. More silhouettes appear. Half-tracks, infantry, another Panther. The Sherman reverses behind its defensive ridge. Haynes reloads. Jackson takes aim again. Second shot. Hit. A half-track explodes, scattering troops into the snow. Third shot. Hit. A German armored car is blown off the road. Smoke fills the forest. Snow and fire mix in a blinding storm. The single Sherman has forced an entire battalion to halt. But the Germans recover quickly. Mortars and machine guns rake the ridge. Anti-tank crews move into position. The Panthers split, trying to flank the lone American tank. Burke orders the driver, Wilson, to reposition. The Sherman crawls backward, engine screaming, treads slipping in the icy mud. A German shell whistles past, exploding against a tree. Shrapnel rains on the hull. Inside, the crew hears the ringing metallic clang of incoming fire. Then, a direct hit. The Sherman rocks violently. The lights inside flicker. Smoke fills the turret. But the armor holds. Jackson wipes his eyes, slams his fist on the breech, and growls, "Load me another." Haynes throws in an armor-piercing round. The gun roars. A German Panzer IV bursts into flame. The German advance stalls once again. Minutes turn into an hour, then another. The forest is littered with burning wrecks. some German, some American jeeps abandoned in retreat. The Sherman has taken multiple hits. Exhaust flames flicker violently. The barrel is glowing red hot. But the crew fights on. Burke radios for support. Silence. Every American unit within miles is either overrun or retreating. They are alone. The Germans circle again. Infantry rush forward with anti-tank charges. Jackson switches to HE rounds and fires into the tree line. Explosions rip open the forest. Shattered branches rain down like knives. The attackers fall back again. Hours pass. The Germans can still not get through. One tank, one crew, stopping an entire armored column. At dusk, the Germans make one last attempt to force the pass. A Panther charges straight down the road, using the burning wreck of the earlier tank as cover. The Sherman crew is exhausted. The ammunition racks are almost empty. Burke orders the final armor-piercing round loaded. Jackson waits, and just as the Panther clears the wreck, he fires. The shot hits the turret ring. The Panther freezes, smokes, and detonates. The Germans break. Their advance collapses. They fall back into the woods. The Sherman stands alone, battered, smoking, immobile, but victorious. And behind it, American reinforcements finally arrive. The road to Bastogne is still in Allied hands. The tank's name was painted on its armor, Cobra King. Its stand became one of the most legendary moments of the Ardennes campaign. Historians estimate it destroyed multiple armored vehicles, dozens of infantry, and halted a force more than 10 times its size. The crew received commendations. The tank became a symbol of defiance, a reminder that in war, numbers alone don't decide everything. Sometimes courage matters more. Sometimes a single tank can change history. And sometimes one crew can stop a battalion. It was supposed to be a quiet sector, a place where exhausted American infantry could finally breathe. But at dawn, on a freezing morning in 1945, everything changed. Because on this forgotten battlefield, barely 1,200 U.S. infantrymen would face something no manual had prepared them for. A German armored force of nearly 400 tanks and assault guns, rolling straight toward them like a steel tidal wave. This is the story of the 12-hour battle no one talks about. A desperate stand where ordinary soldiers held the line against the impossible. The calm before the storm. It began in the hills east of the Rhine, where the 106th Infantry Division had taken positions along a thin, cold ridge. Most of the men were new. Many had never seen a real German tank, only grainy training photos. But they saw the warnings long before they saw the enemy. The ground trembled, birds took flight, and one soldier later said, "The earth began to hum like a train rolling underground." At first, they thought it was thunder. Then came the sound they would never forget. Tracks. Hundreds of them. This wasn't a normal attack. It was a last-chance gamble. The German High Command had scraped together every armored vehicle still capable of movement. Panthers, Panzer IVs, Jagdpanzer IVs, and even aging Stugs pulled out of repair depots. Their mission? Break through the American line within 12 hours and open a corridor to retreat the remains of 2 trapped German armies. If they failed, 50,000 men would be cut off forever. For the Americans, this meant one thing. They were standing directly in the path of a desperate armored stampede. "They're coming out of the forest!" At 8:10, the first panthers appeared, dark silhouettes emerging from the tree line like shadows coming alive. Then more and more. U.S. observers counted until they stopped counting. One officer simply radioed, "We are facing an armored division, possibly two." Artillery opened fire, but the tanks kept coming, spreading out like a fan across the snow. Their turrets swung left and right, searching for targets. The infantrymen dug in on the ridge knew exactly what this meant. They were about to fight armor with rifles. Machine gun nests opened up. Bazooka teams scrambled into position. Anti-tank gunners waited until the last possible moment. A lone M157mm anti-tank gun scored the first kill, hitting a Panther in the side. But the crew died seconds later when another German tank fired back. Everywhere along the front, the story was the same. The Americans slowed the German advance, but could not stop it. Still, they refused to break. Most infantry would withdraw when facing a force this size, but these men didn't. Small squads held crossroads, bridges, and culverts, buying minutes with their lives. A bazooka team of 2 men knocked out 3 tanks before being buried in debris from a 4th. A machine gunner kept firing even as German tanks rolled behind him. His final transmission said only, "I'm still here." By noon, the Germans had advanced, but at a cost they hadn't expected. At 3 p.m., the battlefield shook again, but this time it wasn't German armor. It was American. Shermans from the 9th Armored Division roared in, guns blazing. Not enough to match 400 tanks, but enough to strike at the weakest point of the German formation. The Shermans hit fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, logistics vehicles. Behind the German front line, chaos exploded. The armored wave slowed, then stumbled, then began to fracture. By late afternoon, the Germans should have been miles past the ridge. Instead, they were still fighting for every meter. American infantry who should have been wiped out hours earlier were still holding out in ruined farmhouses, barns, and shell holes. The German commander radioed Berlin in disbelief. "The enemy infantry is everywhere. We cannot break through." The 12-hour limit approached, and then the one thing German armor feared most arrived: air power. Clouds opened just enough for American fighter bombers to scream in. P-47 Thunderbolts swooped down like diving hawks, rockets and bombs hammering the stalled German column. A single strike destroyed 17 vehicles in one pass. Panthers tried to reverse, Stug scattered, flames spread across the valley. The German advance, once unstoppable, dissolved into a burning maze of wrecks. The attack was over. When the shooting finally stopped, the field was littered with steel. The Germans had failed to break through the American line. Their 12-hour window closed. Tens of thousands of their soldiers remained trapped behind the collapsing front. And the American infantry? They had defended their ridge at a terrible price. But they had done the impossible. 1,200 infantrymen had stood against nearly 400 tanks and stopped them. Most history books barely mention it. It wasn't part of a grand strategy. It didn't change the entire war. But for the men who survived it, and for the ones who didn't, it was proof of something far greater. That even against overwhelming odds, courage, grit and the will to stand your ground can rewrite the ending of a battle. The world may have forgotten this 12-hour battle, but history will.
May 5th, 1945. Near the anguished final days of the war in Europe, in the Austrian Tyrol stands a small hill castle, Itter Castle. Picture this: American GIs, German Wehrmacht soldiers, and French VIP prisoners, all locked in together. Then an assault by the SS, and all of them fighting together to defend that castle. It sounds like fiction, yet it's real. Welcome to what many historians call the strangest battle of WWII. By early May 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. Berlin had fallen. Adolf Hitler was dead. Entire German armies were surrendering en masse. But in the small Austrian village of Itter, the weirdness of war reached a peak. A German-run prison inside Itter Castle held prominent French prisoners, ex-prime ministers, generals, a famous tennis player. Meanwhile, some Wehrmacht soldiers, sensing the regime's end, quietly began helping the French prisoners, and an American armored unit arrived to secure the area. Then the SS launched an attack. On 5th May, a force of between 100 and 200 men from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division Götz von Berlichingen attacked the castle. Inside, a tiny defensive force of about 36 Americans, a handful of Wehrmacht soldiers led by Major Josef Gangl, Austrian resistance, and the French VIPs themselves. The Germans and Americans fought side by side, a former enemy fighting with you. Yes, that happened. Supplies were low, communications damaged. The SS pressed the assault. Bullets shredded the walls. Tanks engaged. The defenders' situation grew desperate. At one point, a French tennis legend, Jean Barotra, volunteered to sprint through enemy lines to get help. The castle held on. And then relief arrived late afternoon. American troops smashed through, and the SS withdrew. In the end, the assault failed. The French prisoners were evacuated. The Wehrmacht soldiers who turned side helped save lives. Major Gangl was killed in the battle, fighting for what he believed was right. What makes this moment so remarkable is the coalition of former enemies. German units loyal to Berlin refusing to surrender their own sanity. Wehrmacht soldiers actively fighting the SS. US armor supporting them. A chaotic finale of war where lines blurred and survival of innocence became the cause. Some historians call it the only time in WWII where American and German soldiers fought together in a meaningful defensive battle. And beneath the shock is a simple truth. War isn't always black and white. In the death throes of a regime, sometimes the worst enemy becomes your ally. The greatest horror may drive humanity to its best. Think of the castle walls shaking, the tank's engine roaring, the French prisoners clutching each other while bullets fly. The Wehrmacht soldier beside an American GI, both fighting for one cause. The SS coming through the dawn light. It's cinematic, but it's history. If you like this story of battlefield oddity, hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next hidden WWII saga. This is your window into the forgotten wars, the strange turns, the hidden heroes. For now, remember the little Austrian castle where history bent the rules, where allies became enemies, and enemies became allies at the very last hour of the greatest war the world had known. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious, keep questioning, and never stop exploring the past. It was the winter of 1943. In the remote mountains of Norway, a small team of men moved silently through the snow. The wind cut like a knife, and every step echoed the risk of discovery. Below them, the faint lights of a heavily guarded industrial facility glowed in the valley. Inside that plant, the German war machine was producing something far more dangerous than steel or oil: heavy water, the key ingredient in Hitler's race to build an atomic bomb. For months, Allied intelligence had tracked reports from occupied Norway. Scientists in Berlin were desperate to create a weapon of unimaginable power. But unlike the Americans, who had access to uranium from across the world, Germany's research relied on one rare resource: heavy water, produced only at the Norsk hydro plant in Weimar. The Allies understood that if the Nazis succeeded, the balance of the war could change overnight. Bombing runs had been tried before. None had worked. The plant was built into the mountainside, reinforced by concrete and guarded by snow and ice. Even high-altitude bombers struggled to find their mark. And so, the British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, decided that only one solution remained: sabotage. The plan would be called Operation Gunnerside. 6 Norwegian commandos, all trained in Britain, would be parachuted into the mountains and link up with a small advance team that had been stranded there for months. Together, they would cross the plateau, infiltrate the plant, and destroy its heart, the electrolysis chambers where heavy water was produced. The men chosen were young, skilled, and utterly determined. Their leader was Joachim Rennenberg, just 23 years old. They carried only what they could fit on their backs: skis, explosives, and a single radio. Behind them stretched the frozen wilderness. Ahead, the most critical target in the Nazi nuclear program. As they crossed the Hardangervidda Plateau, temperatures dropped below -30 degrees. The wind erased their tracks within seconds. German patrols roamed the area, searching for saboteurs after a failed earlier mission had left several agents dead or captured. Every mistake now could mean death. Every fire, every footprint could give them away. After days of travel, the team reached the ridge overlooking the Weimar facility. Below them, the plant hummed with machinery and guards. Floodlights swept across the snow. The only way in was a narrow bridge over a gorge, guarded and impossible to cross unnoticed. They needed another way. Using a frozen river as cover, the men climbed down the gorge, crossed the icy water, and then scaled the opposite cliff in total darkness. Their hands bled from the cold metal. The sound of a single loose stone could have meant discovery, but the night remained silent. By 1 a.m., they reached the lower entrance of the plant. A single Norwegian worker, secretly loyal to the resistance, had left a window unlocked. The commandos slipped inside, their boots echoing softly against the concrete. In the shadows, the machinery loomed like an iron forest. They moved quickly, placing explosive charges on the pipes and tanks that fed the heavy water cells. Each man knew exactly where to go. The charges were small, precise, enough to destroy the equipment but not to kill the workers. They set the fuses for 30 seconds. Then they turned and ran. A deep, muffled blast shook the mountainside. Steam burst from the plant's vents. Sparks rained from shattered pipes. The entire production line was gone in seconds. German guards rushed to the site, rifles ready, confused and shouting orders. But there was nothing to see,
only smoke and twisted metal. The saboteurs had vanished back into the night. Within hours, they were skiing across the plateau, disappearing into the wilderness as the first searchlights swept the valley. When the German command in Oslo received word of the attack, disbelief spread through the ranks. How could anyone have breached one of the most secure facilities in occupied Europe? Dozens of suspects were arrested. Villages were raided. But the truth remained hidden. The commandos have escaped to Sweden, their mission complete. The raid destroyed hundreds of pounds of heavy water and crippled Nazi atomic research for months. Later, German scientists tried to rebuild the program, but never again would it reach the same level. In 1944, when the last shipment of heavy water was sent by ferry across Lake Tinjo, Norwegian resistance fighters sank the vessel, ensuring the Nazis would never recover what they lost. Historians still debate how close Germany truly was to building an atomic weapon. But one thing is certain: without heavy water, their chances vanished. The courage of a handful of men in the snow may have stopped a nuclear disaster before it began. After the war, Joachim Runnenberg and his team returned home quietly. They rarely spoke of what they had done. To them, it was simply their duty, a small act of defiance in a world consumed by tyranny. The mission remained one of the most successful acts of sabotage in history. In a war fought with tanks, planes, and armies, it was a few silent footsteps in the snow that changed everything. They carried no banners, commanded no fleets, but their courage struck a blow that echoed through the decades. A reminder that sometimes history is decided not by the might of nations, but by the will of a few who refuse to surrender.
World War II. We remember the epic battles, the D-Day landings, the brutal Eastern Front. We remember the soldiers, the sacrifices, the sheer scale of human conflict. But behind the front lines, another war was raging. A hidden battle, fought not with bullets, but with blueprints. Not by soldiers, but by scientists, engineers, and codebreakers. This was the technological arms race, a relentless high-stakes contest between the Axis powers and the Allies. A desperate scramble for innovation where victory could hinge on a single breakthrough, a faster plane, an unbreakable code, or a terrifying new weapon. This secret war didn't just influence battles, it defined them, reshaped the world, and catapulted humanity into a new technological age. This is the story of the Axis versus Allies tech war, the incredible inventions, the ingenious countermeasures, and the race for the ultimate weapon that changed our world forever. The seeds of this tech war were sown in the aftermath of World War I. Stagnant trench warfare had shown the brutal cost of outdated tactics. In the interwar years, military thinkers grappled with new possibilities: faster tanks, more powerful aircraft, the potential of radio and early radar. As Nazi Germany prepared for conflict, it embraced radical new doctrines built on speed and coordination. Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, wasn't just tactics, it was enabled by technology. Concentrated forces of panzer tanks communicating via radio, supported by terrifying Stuka dive bombers acting as precision aerial artillery. In the early years, this combination proved devastatingly effective, rapidly overwhelming Poland, France, and much of Europe. At sea, Germany unleashed its U-boat fleet, employing wolf-pack tactics to strangle Allied shipping in the Atlantic. Improved torpedoes and snorkel technology allowing submarines to run diesel engines while submerged made them ever more lethal predators. In the Pacific, Japan demonstrated its own technological prowess. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter was, for a time, the finest carrier aircraft in the world, fast, agile, and long-ranged. Combined with highly trained pilots and bold carrier tactics, Japan achieved stunning initial victories, including the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. But the Allies, though initially caught off guard, possessed immense industrial potential and scientific brilliance. The tech war shifted gears. It became a battle of innovation and mass production. Great Britain, standing alone in 1940, relied heavily on technological defense. The chain-home radar system, a network of coastal towers, provided crucial early warning during the Battle of Britain, allowing outnumbered RAF fighters to intercept German bombers. And hidden away at Bletchley Park, brilliant minds waged a secret war against German codes. Breaking the Enigma machine cipher, codenamed Ultra, gave the Allies unprecedented insights, often war-winning, into Axis plans. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union faced annihilation, but responded with staggering resilience and industrial might. The T-34 tank, with its sloped armor, powerful gun, and wide tracks suited for the harsh terrain, shocked the Germans and became a cornerstone of the Red Army's eventual victory. Crude but effective Katyusha rocket launchers rained down terror on Axis positions. And then there was the United States, the arsenal of democracy. American industry churned out staggering quantities of war material: Sherman tanks, Liberty ships, B-17 flying fortress bombers, overwhelming the Axis through sheer volume. But it wasn't just quantity. American science delivered critical innovations. Advanced radar and sonar ASDIC systems turned the tide against the U-boats. The proximity fuse, a tiny radar in artillery shells, dramatically increased anti-aircraft effectiveness. Facing defeat on all fronts, Nazi Germany desperately pinned its hopes on radical wonder weapons, or Wunderwaffen. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, briefly outclassed Allied planes, but arrived too late and in too few numbers. The V-1 flying bomb, a primitive cruise missile, and the V-2 rocket, the first ballistic missile, terrorized London, but were militarily ineffective. These were technological marvels born of desperation, not strategic game-changers. The Allied technological and industrial advantage proved decisive. Ultra-intelligence guided critical operations. Allied radar directed fighters and bombers. Sonar hunted U-boats. Long-range bombers crippled Axis industry. And ultimately, the most secret project of all reached fruition. The Manhattan Project, a colossal Allied scientific effort, unlocked the power of the atom.
Check the voltage again.
In August 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan's surrender and ushering in the nuclear age with terrifying finality. The technological arms race of World War II was fought with feverish intensity, accelerating innovation at an unprecedented rate. Jet engines, rocketry, radar, code breaking, penicillin, nuclear power, early computing, technologies that defined the latter 20th century surged forward under the pressures of total war. It was a war won as much in the laboratory and the factory as on the battlefield. This relentless pursuit of technological supremacy saved millions, cost millions, and unleashed forces that continue to shape our world, reminding us of the profound and often perilous link between innovation and conflict.